Good evening and welcome to the New York Society Library. I'm Sarah Holliday, Library Events Coordinator, and I'm mostly standing here to ask you to silence your cell phone. Feel free to turn it back on once you're out in your favorite city square. As New York City's oldest cultural institution, we're particularly thrilled to have with us two speakers who embody some of the best things about our city today. Adam Gopnik has been a staff writer for The New Yorker since 1986. He's excelled in magazine writing as well as with books like the bestseller Angels and H's and the beloved Paris to the Moon, and with that essential New Yorkie art form, musical theater, collaborating with David Shire and others. Catie Marron has improved New York City in beautiful and tangible ways as chair of the board of directors of Friends of the High Line. In addition, for 7 years, she chaired the board of the New York Public Library, where she continues to serve as a trustee. Relevant books, including this one, are for sale by the corner bookstore in the Peluso Family Exhibition Gallery, and we encourage you to patronize them after the event. Between New York, UNORC, Paris, the High Line, and the Public Library, we could not have better guides to the world's city squares. Please join me in welcoming Adam Gopnik and Catie Marron.
Thank you. And dear to my heart was that reference to UNORC. Some of you may know that UNORC is the alternative city in a book I wrote for my daughter, a children's fantasy called Steps Across the Water, where New York turns out to be to UNORC what Altoona is to Manhattan. Our New York is just a small suburb of a much greater city called New York. So thank you for that. Catie, good to see you. Good to see you. So tell me how you got this idea. I came in late to contribute to it. How did you get this idea for a book about city squares?
I guess you could say it started with the first book I did a few years ago on city parks. And on that one, I had realized many, many years ago that I adored city parks. And whenever I traveled to any city, I'd always gravitate there. So I was looking for books for myself and never found any. So I thought, wouldn't that be a fun idea? But we had young children, and I just put this idea aside. And then a few years ago, after I had just stepped down from chairing the board of the New York Public Library, as Sarah mentioned, and obviously I love libraries, and this is a very special one. The idea popped back into my head, and it happened. I had a great time working with HarperCollins, really enjoyed doing that, wonderful people there, we had a superb team, and so we were all thinking about possibly doing another book. The idea of city squares really came totally out of the blue, and I had never before thought about city squares. What happened is that in March of 2014, I can remember it exactly, our family was taking a special family trip to Rome, and we were staying right around the corner from the Piazza del Popolo, which of course is a lovely city square. And as you know, for those of you who know Rome, you'll know in all of Italy, there are squares everywhere. So you couldn't help but bump into one here and there and everywhere. At the same time, there's the huge geopolitical crisis in Kiev, Ukraine was going on. It was named Euromaidan, Maidan meaning square in several languages. And I was reading everything I could on that. It was a huge event at the time, as I'm sure you all know. The commentators would compare it to the protests that happened 2 years earlier in Taksim Square in Istanbul, Turkey. And I then suddenly realized that, in fact, I had been there just 2 months before the huge protest. And then, literally, it was sort of, for me, a eureka moment, because out of the blue, the three came together, and I realized what a difference there was in the three. And I thought, wow, city squares are really important. And I looked into it more. I realized that they have been really important since they were agora in ancient Greece. And it just seemed like a fascinating topic, and I've learned so much doing it.
One of the things that I thought made the book remarkable when it arrived, and I got a chance to see it, is that when you first mentioned it to me, Catie, oh, that's a wonderful idea, but I had imagined something, to be honest with you, more modest in scope. And this is a book you've brought together, an astonishing collection of writers, and the essays are, on the whole, very serious about politics, social history. It's really a book about urbanism. It's in the deepest sense.
Yeah, I would agree with that. To me, it's quite a meaty book, yeah. A true nonfiction book, and the writers across the board I find outstanding. But here's one right here, and I felt very fortunate when Adam agreed to do this. I'll tell you that when friends get this book, by far the great majority will write to me and say the first essay they went to is Positive Ocean. So you have a lot of fans. And I'm curious, can I turn the question to you for a second? You did sign on, and you seem to sign on with enthusiasm. What appealed to you about this idea?
Well, I'm a city lover, as I suspect everyone in this room is, and it's one of my, I'm sort of like Odysseus lashed to the mast of New York, while the siren song of Connecticut is heard over and over by my wife, who's constantly leaving little, real estate pamphlets, pointing out how much space and greenery we could get in New Jersey or Connecticut or points north for what we pay in New York. I believe in cities, love cities. I can't imagine living outside the city. And so the idea of the city square instantly appealed to me. And of course, you asked me very astutely to write about the Place de Vosges, which is a great city square in Paris, which is a place dear to my heart. And it got me thinking, as I said to you, sort of instantly. I mean, I agreed to do it. One of the only great piece of literary advice I ever got. Did I tell you this?
No,
I'm not sure I did. Is from, I think, one of the greatest writers of the last century, John Updike. And Updike said to me once, when I had started writing 30 years ago for The New Yorker, he said, and if any of you ever knew Updike, he was like the CEO of literature. He had beautiful silver hair, and he was 8 feet tall, and he had his kind of eyes half shut in contemplation of his own perfection. And he said to me, "Oh, Mr. Gopnik, you're really something of a prolific writer, as am I, and you might think of always saying yes to everything, because you'll waste more energy deciding what to say no to than just writing." And I thought, that's, and if you remember Updike's career, it was like that. You would find him in Popular Mechanics as often as in The New Yorker. And so that was sort of the overriding thing. If something interests me, I always say yes, because it's always interesting to do it. And the challenge, you don't know what the challenge is going to be, what the rewards are going to be. But I was particularly interested in it because I love the Place de Vosges, and it was extraordinarily astute of you to ask me to do that rather than the Place de la Concorde. And as soon as you'd asked me to do it, I got to thinking about the nature of city squares. And the first thing that came to my mind was the first sentence of this little essay. And that is that there's a basic difference in, when we think about the great squares, between domestic squares and declamatory squares. It's one of those facile, tendentious distinctions I specialize in, but I think it has a little bit of truth in it. That we think about, the great declamatory squares. I was thinking about San Marco in Venice, which is maybe the greatest of city squares in some ways. So we're thinking about Trafalgar Square. Those are squares where things happen, marches, demonstrations, heretics get hanged, and so on.
Also, though, you think of Red Square.
Red Square,
which is
yep.
next book in Tiananmen Square.
Yeah, exactly. Even
and
more,
so,
right.
A huge square.
Exactly.
They're very different.
Right, and my colleagues, David Remnick and George Packer, really have the declamatory squares covered in this book. They talk about squares as places of public action. Was it David or George who said, dictators regret the existence of city squares?
That's David.
There's David said it, right? And so that's that's a very important kind of square, and this book does them great justice. Then there's the other kind that's sort of the domestic square, like the Place de Vosges is the primary one that you sort of turn into it. It keeps its secrets from you. But what fascinated me, and this is what I mean about the glories, but the joys of being a yes writer, I didn't know the history of the Place de Vosges until you asked me to write something about it. I'd spent a lot of time in and around it, of course, as anyone who lives in Paris for a while does. But the story, and what the nice thing, and these are the serendipities of assignments, is that I was on my way to Paris shortly after you had asked me to take it on, to do a very different story about the redevelopment of Paris, and particularly the attempt to remodel the Samaritan department store. Do you remember that? In that way. And the leader of the move to prevent them from remodeling the Samaritan turned out to be an architectural historian, Antoine Gadi, who wrote his thesis on the Place de Vosges, on the history of the Place de Vosges. So I got him to talk to me and to point me in the right direction. And it turned out to be that the Place de Vosges was the first really, without exaggeration, the first real instance of the process that we now think of as gentrification, because it was built by the king, by Henri, as a way of luring in manufacturers from Italy, luxury manufacture, and they had a really beautiful kind of utopian urban scheme to put the factories, so to speak, they didn't call them factories, the ateliers, on the second floor, where they would bring in Italian textile artisans to make things, have the workers living on under the dormers up above, and then sell them on the ground floor around. Wonderful scheme. But after they had started doing it, and then the king died, was killed, they realized, the investors realized that this is true, that they were worth much more as residential property than they were as ongoing industrial, light industry. And so they all got sold for residences, so that process that we now know all too well, by which, Soho gets turned from cast iron, from small businesses into lofts, in a very real sense began at the Place des Vosges. So that's the sort of thing I never would have learned had I not asked. But coming back to you, I want to ask you, how did you seek? I call them domestic and declamatory. But did you seem to have consciously sought a balance between pieces that would be very serious about social history and other ones that would be more pleasure giving, if not small, but delightful.
Plus Vosges, or the residential squares in London.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and there are, I think, great photographs here. At one point, we had 6 photo researchers looking for them. That was a production. But, for instance, there are photographs of these beautiful residential squares. And then the next one will be a hugely violent photograph of some huge protest. So it's fascinating to me from an illustrative point of view to how different they are. But what I did was to try to find squares around the world that represented, each square certainly had its own story, and each square was meant to represent a type of square. So for instance, we talk about Mandela making his first speech after 27 years in prison and going to the Grand Parade in Cape Town, and why he chose that square. And speeches in squares. Of course, we could think of many and many. So that was an example of a place where speeches are made. George Packard is the one who talks generally about history, and he made a similar point to yours about declamatory versus domestic. And I think it's a fascinating one about how some are imposed by the state, and those that are imposed for state occasions, for grandeur, for pageantry, for parades, for hangings, you name it. Those are the ones that tend not to be used day to day. And it's the ones that were smaller, that grew up organically to fulfill the needs of the people in the area, that are the ones that are very much loved. I would love to ask you a question. Adam points out that, and it is true, it's the only square in this book, and it's also of beautiful proportions. How much do you think aesthetics have played a role in making it such a success?
The Place des Vosges. Yeah, absolutely. It is a square, which almost, and I think it is the only one in the book that is. I think that's part of its mystique and part of its allure. One of the fascinating things about the Place des Vosges, as all of you will know who've spent time in Paris or read some history of Paris, is that it declined quite vertiginously for a long time. The Marais, the part of Paris that it superintends, became a poor neighborhood, then became a Jewish neighborhood, and still has a great synagogue right alongside it, and only more latterly became highly valued again, highly prized. If any of you are fans of the Inspector Marais novels, Georges Simenon's great books, you know that he spends an inordinate amount of time in and around the Place des Vosges. There's a cafe there called My Burgundy, that he visits. It's still in place there. But when the inspector is going there to meditate on the melancholy of murder and human lives, you'll recall it's not a wealthy place. It's a working man's place to go to, and that was very much its vibe. Even I can remember from when I was a kid visiting Paris, living in Paris with my folks, that was still very much its vibe. And in fact, someone was telling me, you know, Richard Rogers, the great architect, rented an apartment there with his wonderful wife, Ruthie, in the early 70s when they were building Beaubourg, because it was a place you could walk to work and you could afford to live there, sort of like renting a loft in Soho in the same time, right? It wasn't yet priced beyond anyone's means, and it became kind of center for Americans. So that was the vibe of it and the take of it. Do aesthetics matter? I think they matter enormously. I do think that George is quite right, that the squares that sort of speak most deeply to our hearts are not. San Marco is an exception, right? Because San Marco,
because it is large and yet people love it.
Right, it's the living room of Europe, someone once said, and I think that's true. But certainly, nobody ever proposed in Trafalgar Square, I don't think. But every great demonstration, you know, whether it was, you know, the night that the British won the Second World War or the great anti-nuclear demonstrations, tends to unroll there. I think that's a very truthful distinction. We just got back from Rome ourselves, and wonderful week. And one of the things that's striking is the kind of hierarchy of squares, and of that kind that Palazzo Popolo has one whole kind of role. And now I'm losing my mind. The wonderful, help me someone, the wonderful market square that's not far from the Pantheon. Yes, exactly. The Campo de Fiore is like a model of the kind of square you're talking about, the sort of self-organizing, organic square.
My book is in there. I wish I had it right here, because I would show you pictures, because we have the flower markets being photographed there, and it's just such a wonderful shop with bright colors of flowers.
You know, that's something I wanted to ask you, Katie, I've never stopped thinking about it. Are there lost squares? Did that come up in the course of researching places that were destroyed over? I guess Covent Garden a little bit has lost, and Les Halles in Paris. They're not really squares, but they were sort of public gathering places.
Yes, I think there are some that are lost. I was looking at one the other day, and I've forgotten what it is. I never heard of it, but it is now a traffic circle. Yeah. But it was many, many years ago a square. One thing I found in history is that the square's purpose can change over time as the culture changes. It's fascinating to go back to the area at the time of ancient Greece, because when they were designed then, they were designed to be the pinnacle of democracy, and they were held up as that. And George Packer makes the point that it's the New England square that is the most similar to the Agora.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The common. Yeah. Okay.
New thing.
Yeah. Well, that's fascinating. But one of the things that George emphasizes in his essay, and I thought that made me think a lot, is that, as David Remnick says, that we can't, dictators regret the persistence of public squares, and the Tiananmen, I think of Medellin, and so on. But it is sort of astonishing when you think about it, isn't it, that in the age of virtual reality, in the age of the internet, the public square, the gathering place, remains a very potent public vessel.
That is so true. Several of the essays in the geopolitics section are about protest movements that have happened in just the last 5 years. And in every case, social media played a huge role. In Tahrir Square, that's a fascinating essay to me, written by somebody who was there at the time. She actually made a phenomenal documentary about it, but it's basically her diary of being there and what happened. And they did create a pop-up city with really a basic town and all the facilities of the town. But all the announcements to get people to come were done over social media. Same thing in the Ukraine, in Kiev, the one I mentioned earlier. There was one journalist who was just outrageous at the government, and he decided we have to do something. So he went out on his Facebook page and said, guys, we've got to do something, get together, let's go to the square. And sure enough, by the time he got there, there were already almost 100 people there. And before the night was over, there were thousands. And over the next month, there were hundreds of thousands of people in the square. Social media would tell you what to do, same with Occupy Wall Street here. But one thing that I find fascinating is that while there is a virtual square being developed, and particularly for teenagers who are what they call digital natives, it's the protest movements, the big happenings did not happen They happen in physical space. And one other thing I find fascinating, it ends with an essay about the virtual square, is that
Written by
Gillian Tett, who's a phenomenal journalist. She actually is an anthropologist by training, so she comes to it from that point of view. And she is a great journalist. She's run the FT, the American FT. And she actually had a photograph of Hacker Square, which is the physical square in Facebook's new headquarters. And there's Facebook, right? The most virtual square of all. And what do? They create a physical square. And her essay was with a photograph of that square.
Yes, exactly. It's astonishing, actually. I was just out in Portland last week. And whenever you go to one of those extraordinarily kind of cool startups that make us feel several hundred years old and so on, they always have to put in a gathering space because there are things that happen by adjacency that can't happen by virtual connection. In fact, I had a debate once with my good friend Malcolm Gladwell on this subject because one of the things because Malcolm is a Twitter skeptic, he thinks that in fact that Twitter is vastly overrated as a social media magnet. And one of the things that struck me, and it struck me again reading the book, Catie, is that there tends to be a very predictable rhythm or momentum to revolutions, to great moments of social change. There's something that brings people together. It can be pamphlets in 1789, it can be Twitter and social media in 2015, and then people assemble in a public square. They begin to protest against whatever it is the government is doing, and then you come to a fracture point where either the army will act against them or will refuse to act against them. Tiananmen Square, they acted against them. Maidan in other places.
Also Tahrir Square.
In Tahrir Square, even better example, right? And so that there's something extraordinarily sort of eternal, universal, human about the anthropology of the protest in the public square.
I totally agree. If there's one overarching theme that has come out of this book when I went through it, is that, and it sounds simplistic, I think, but it really, I don't think it's simplistic at all. Squares are all about people, and they are for people in every sort of stage. And David Adjaye is the one architect who's included in the book. Everyone else is a very serious writer, but he's also a writer, and he's going to open the African American Museum at Smithsonian this fall. He's doing a lot of work. He talks about Marrakesh, but he comes to it from an architect's eye. And he says it's not the actual space that's meaningful. It's the opportunity for the people to be inside it, to do whatever they're doing. That's what's meaningful. And another point he makes, which I find very interesting, is that it's a democratic space. It's certainly free. And when you think of cities, this place isn't free. Most places, are not open to the public. There are apartments, or houses, or whatever. They're offices, but they're not open to everybody. They're private. And so public space is the one accessible space that is free to everybody. And it allows diversity. So it allows so many different kinds of people to come together. I have several stories in the book, maybe we'll talk about it in a little while, about strangers meeting and what happens when strangers meet and how important that is. I'd love to continue, but I just have to tell you something that I thought was sort of funny, and I probably shouldn't, but when you talked about John Updike and how he said it's faster to just go ahead and write it instead of saying no, and then you talked about Portland. We had what I thought was going to be a fantastic essay on the American Square. And I thought a terrific writer who was going to do it. And the writer talked to me about it, wrote about it in the beginning, and she really seemed to understand exactly what this was all about. Well, just about the time all the essays were floating in, she started to have a reason why it couldn't be done. And so that would go on for a couple of weeks. And then she'd have another reason. And the emails would go 10 paragraphs long, 3 pages long in the book. And I kept thinking, another dog ate my homework, an excuse. And it went on and on and on, and we'd try again and again, different ways. I'd go in at it, somebody else would go in at it, and she'd promise it, and sure, that would never happen. So finally, we had to bow out. So John Updike is right, because I would say, I literally said that if you just spent the time writing,
wrote the emails of apology for not writing.
Emails, we would have had a great essay.
You know, just to enlarge on, that is absolutely true, and it happens it's every editor's deep grievance, right? That if a writer would simply invest the energy in writing that they tend to invest in explaining why they are unable to write, son of a bitch, because you're stopping me from writing, they would be better. But Updike actually enlarged on the point that I was making. He said, and I think this is true and generous, as he was, that there are yes writers and no writers. And that you're either a yes writer or a no writer. And a no writer makes an enormous emotional investment in saying no, in resisting. And some of the greatest writers there have ever been have been no writers. They say, I'm not going to do that. I'll never write nonfiction. I don't write book reviews. I don't do things like that. And they get enormous energy out of the accumulation of negations that they offer to the world. And some people just need to do that, and they have extraordinary careers of another kind. And Updike's point was, you have to figure out early on in your life which you are. If you're a no writer, you snarl and say no, and if you're a yes writer, you smile and say yes, and then you do it. And then you do it. And then you do either one, and they're both completely legitimate ways of proceeding as a writer or as an artist, I suppose. But that is. I have to bring you, Catie, to where we are tonight. I mean, specifically the Society Library, but more broadly the city of New York. Because one of the fascinating things, and we were talking about this the other day, about New York, is that we have a very ambiguous relationship to the idea of the public square here.
Totally true. And this is one area where I really felt the book fell down a bit. It's America, and partially because of the woman whose dog
didn't write the Portland,
right, Portland and Illinois, even though she took a 3-day trip doing research there. Anyway, moving on.
We'll get her name eventually.
In America, for some reason, squares are not as important. So as George Packer said, it's a New England square, and it's usually designed with a courthouse and a church and some other municipal building and a monument in the center and some grass and trees. To him, that's a perfect town square. And in Savannah and other places, they really had great significance in history. In New York, I looked at it, and really, there are not a lot of squares. There are hybrids, like Washington Square Park, and if I had to choose, I would say it's more of a park than a square. We were talking about the High Line recently, and several of my friends from the High Line are here, and thank you for coming. That is a hybrid, because, or at least the way Michael Kimmelman describes it, and I loved it, and he referred particularly to Madison Square Park and that triangle that's now sort of a square. And he said, a park is a retreat. It's a place to get away, to be alone, to think, to just be by yourself. And a square is being in the midst of things, and people go to be in the middle. They go to watch stuff happen. They go to be with other people. And so that, the Bloomberg administration, he has created sort of a Times Square, a square in Times Square. To me, it's more of, it's a stopping place for tourists. I don't think that really is much of a square. And then this small triangle in Madison Square, which has become a very popular area.
Very potent. Well, the High Line fascinates me. I was sort of in on the High Line very early on because I rolled under the fence when Joel was doing photographs there and wrote an early piece about it. Never imagined they would pull it off. I just thought, well, here's a pro bono thing, and it's become this thing. What fascinates me about the High Line is that it's a very long, thin square. In intention, if you go to the Promenade Pantée in Paris, which was one of the models for it, that's really more like a park because you do sort of escape into it. What I think has been fascinating about watching the High Line evolve is that for my son's generation, 20-year-olds, they meet there. They meet on the High Line, and then they do things. They gather there. They treat it as a kind of spaghetti-shaped square, right? As a long, thin place, but they treat it primarily as a gathering place rather than as an escape route, as a park can be. But Times Square is also a fascinating case, right? Because it has none of the qualities of a public square traditionally, right? There's sort of no place to square. You look at it and say, where is the square here, right? I don't spot it. And then on New Year's Eve, it's adapting and becomes for that one night one of the great public squares in the world, and fulfills all the duties and obligations of a public square. It's democratic, it's open, it's celebratory, it marks occasions and all of that too. So it's this odd thing about New York, this most pragmatic of cities. We sort of put together a square when we need it. The one exception I can think of, the one true square, at least in my experience here in the city, in Manhattan at least, is Union Square.
Absolutely.
And Union Square fascinates me. In fact, I've written a musical comedy called Table, which is set entirely in Union Square, where we use Union Square as a kind of the green market in Union Square, as the piazza, like an old-fashioned commedia dell'arte, exactly because it plays that function. People meet there, the green market brings people together from all over. Foodies meet farmers every Saturday morning. People coming up from the village meet people coming down from the Upper East Side or the Upper West Side. And it's been an astonishing, that wasn't the case when I first came to New York 35 years ago. Union Square didn't play that role, but more than any other space I can think of in Manhattan, it now does.
I totally agree with you, and I've looked into the history of Union Square. It was created in the early 1800s, and in fact, at the time, it was meant to copy the residential squares of London, which interestingly were designed to copy Place des Vosges. So history continues. But then, for this reason or that, it wasn't working, and in the late 1800s, it was Olmsted, in fact, who redesigned the entire area and designed it to be a gathering place, to be a meeting place. And it seemed to be particularly left-wing movements, labor movements, that had their meetings there. And Union Square, which was named for the union of two streets that came together, not for other reasons, which I would have thought. Union Square, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought.
Union Square became a gathering place for the left in Union.
Yes,
Right.
and then the Labor Day. And then what was very new to me is the description of what happened after 9/11. And I don't know how many of you will remember this, but Union Square was the closest large place, open space, where the catastrophe hit. And a day or two after 9/11, people started going to Union Square. They came with candles, they came with flowers, they came with other sorts of memorials. They took chalk and would write messages in the concrete. And there's a photo of that here. And when you think about it, they were all strangers, but they had a need to be together. And there is a good example of the importance of a square and why it's all about people. In this case, it's not for a happy reason, obviously, and not always are they happy reasons at all. It's for a very sad and moving reason, but I can imagine how meaningful it was to the people at that time.
Absolutely, and I can remember too, so clearly reporting that week that it became a kind of gallery of those heartbreaking, improvised, Xeroxed, missing images that were so, and I remember at the time thinking, these are so extraordinary, so heartbreaking, because of course everyone knew that these people weren't missing, they had died within 48 hours. And yet it was a very important part of the ritual of mourning not to have them, define them as missing. And I thought to myself, someone should collect all of these because they'll be an invaluable civic resource someday. And then I thought, but no one can take any of them because to take one would be to violate the mourning that was going on. I think in hope and trust someone did collect those Union Square missing posters because they were the way New York mourned in that terrible and yet very moving week. But I do think it's true that that's exactly the quality that a city square has that no other place can have. It becomes a place that we make for ourselves. You know, it fascinates me, Katie. I didn't know that Olmsted was responsible for the re-articulation of it. But I always think about Olmsted because it was Olmsted, as people tend to forget, even now, though it's more widely known, that Olmsted was a writer, a journalist, before he was a park designer. And one of my favorite of all of Olmsted's remarks is he said that the quality of say the culture, quality of the country depends on its commonplace civilization. And by its commonplace civilization, that all the things that weren't part of the ceremonial, official, pompous life of City Hall and the White House or wherever it might be, that the commonplace civilization were people gathering in shared places to become citizens.
As we talked about Olmsted, I was thinking we're here with an expert, Betsy Barlow Rogers, who was the first administrator of the Central Park Conservancy. She created it. She brought Central Park back into its thriving state that it is today. So I'm sure you know everything we're saying in
Speaking of that, I think we have spoken long enough, but we would love to turn it over to you and take some questions on questions of civic life, civic squares, city squares, New York, Paris, points beyond. First question's always the hardest. All right. Come.
History, Tompkins Square, of course, was the kind of icon for hippiedom, and all the things that were happening at that point was kind of a focal point. And I think still in our history, you think of Tompkins Square as such a window.
Did everyone hear that? The Tompkins Square in the Lower East Side played a similar role of a gathering place. Tompkins Square, in my experience, always had that, like Washington Square Park, always had that funny business that it was you were sort of most at home on a bench in Tompkins Square. It's an odd thing. I have a piece in the magazine in the New Yorker this week that ends in Washington Square Park because there's this wonderful psychologist, brilliant guy named Dr. Keltner, whose pleasure in life, he's a student of emotions, is to go. He was the guy who was the advisor on Inside Out, that lovely Pixar movie about the little girl. And what was going on in her head. And what he likes best to do is to go to a public place and watch people be embodied, as he says, just to watch the interchange of bodies and touching. And he said, and I thought it was interesting, he said Washington Square Park is the best place to do that. But that's different than a square. He said you couldn't do it in Union Square because people are on their way. People go to Union Square with a mission. And I tend to think that I would hardly call Tompkins Square a domestic park, but it has some of that quality.
Michael Kimmelman had a friend who told him that there's what he calls the kitchen, what I call the kitchen analogy, and it's when you go to a party, you generally you don't want to go into the living room, which is very staid and quiet, but you want to go into the kitchen, yes, because that's where everything happens, where people come and go to the refrigerator, and that's where the action is, and that's when people come to a square.
Yes, we have a line in our show, actually, nobody lives in the living room, right? And that's true, and that's true. Oh, I know what I wanted to cite. You know, one of the greatest of all New York song lyrics is that great, by Larry Hart, that wonderful song, Give It Back to the Indians, that he wrote in the Depression, and he says, and I'm not going to get it right, but Reds up in Union, blues down Wall Street losing hope, Reds up in Union Square. That's how the city was divided in 1936. Gentlemen here.
So, circles, squares.
I would not say Columbus Circle is a square because there's nowhere for people to gather.
Yes, there is.
Well, in the center, you mean where the fountain is? Well, yes, that's right. I don't think of it as a square, but who knows? Tahrir Square is, again, a traffic circle.
Right.
And that became a square when everyone piled into it and took it over. And there's some great photos in here, I think, about what happened there. But as we were talking earlier, there and all these other places, they created little cities with kitchens and general stores and libraries and medical facilities. And, I don't know, but can you imagine some major protest happening in Columbus Circle? And probably not here.
I think if there ever were to be it's an interesting question.
It is.
Thought about it. I would think that probably Times Square would be taken over in that way and be self-organized, I suspect, don't you? If we ever rebelled, as we may do sometime.
I can imagine it coming up. I'm starting to think.
Right. This may happen sometime in mid-November.
Yes, I would say maybe, or maybe Union Square. Yeah. I could see it there. And when you think about Bernie Sanders and the huge rally he had it in Washington Square Park.
Yes, not in Union Square. It's interesting. Maybe here.
Bryant Park has become square, I think. Like Bryant Park.
Yes, Bryant.
Behind the library.
No.
Well, makes me ask, Katie, didn't the library put a great deal of energy into rehabilitating Bryant Park?
A huge amount of energy. About 20 years ago, it really was a drug-ridden place, a dangerous place. It's beautiful. It's amazing. I totally agree. I got to know that a bit, and you're right. There's so many different kinds of activities for people. To me, I think of it maybe because it's so green that it's more of a park, and it's called Bryant Park. But that whole area was once a reservoir, and it was built over for the library and Bryant Park.
And it's true, isn't it? Many of the libraries, much of the library's book repository is underneath there. I always find that a thrilling thought whenever I'm walking. It's kind of a Borgesian idea, you know. You're walking to get your lunch, and all the learning of the world is under your feet.
Well, not only that, but then when Bryant Park wanted to put in their ice skating rink about 8 years ago, there was the big question about whether they would leak on books.
Oh, I never stopped thinking about that. Someone else, gentleman here.
Yeah, I guess most people don't live in New York, and they don't live in cities either. They live in suburbs. I haven't read your book, but I look forward to it. But is there such a thing as a successful suburban square, or is it just a parking lot?
You know, people think of the center of shopping malls and creating some sort of a square, and that's breaking down, particularly teenagers. I've read the statistics, and now a third of them opt not to get driver's licenses because they don't need them, and they're happy at home with their social media, so they're not piling into the shopping mall. And shopping malls, as you know, are going downhill. But I read an amazing statistic that about 3 years ago, it turned out that over half of the world's population lives in city squares. Lives in cities, rather. Hopefully squares. But lives in cities. And that's estimated to be 3/4 of the population in about 30 years from now. So actually people are migrating to
Well, they
cities.
live in metropolitan area. We have a very vast metropolitan area, but that metropolitan area, as you know, is really mostly suburban. We have far more suburbanites in the New York metropolitan area than we do city people.
I think that's true. Urban, it's one of the crises of our time. Katie's absolutely right that the mall played that role as a social gathering place for a long time. And one of the biggest social transformations in American life in the past 10 years, too little reported on, is the decline of malls and suburban malls, and the loss of that place owing to internet shopping and the rest of it. It is striking that when you go to I spent half my life on the road, right, going from one American town to the next. And what's amazing is, one of the things that's amazing for me is that when you see the extraordinary urban renaissance, it really is happening across the country, that the public square, Pioneer Square, right, is down. And the one thing that's always true in America is it's always connected to food. You know, that bringing food trucks is a very, very powerful way of bringing people. Americans like to eat, and they like artisanal food, and they like those relationships. And I think that that's, I don't know if it's peculiarly American, but it is very American.
Well, it's also very highlight. My 3 friends over there could attest. In the first few years that the High Line was open, we did not have food. We did not have vendor trucks.
I remember.
And then what people wanted most was food offerings. And so we went very carefully around choosing the right kinds of places with the best food possible that suited the High Line.
Right.
And they're very popular.
No, hugely popular. No, this is the food public gathering nexus, we could call it, in America seems very popular. Gentlemen here.
Some of these squares that are called squares, like Trafalgar Square or Grand Army Plaza, seem to have some of the characteristics of squares, but you can't really treat them as a square. They're not a square, but they're hubs, and they're places where people mingle and where people go to show themselves. How do you fit them into squares?
It's a good example of what I call the declamatory square in that way. Do you mean Grand Army Plaza in Manhattan or in Brooklyn?
The one at 59th Street.
The one at 59th Street. That's a fascinating one, isn't it? I'm a horrible bore with the kids in every way. And one of the things I'm horribly boring about with them is whenever we go through that we're not well aware that that's a well-organized and choreographed public memorial space, right? That the statue, that great St. Gaudens statue of General Sherman, isn't a one-off, that bears a relationship to the entirety of that space, which they're totally blind to. They just see Bergdorf Plaza and the Golden Statue, and that's their experience of it.
Apple Store.
Beg pardon?
Apple Store.
And the Apple Store, yes, exactly, the Apple Store. That's their public square, and they visit all of those places, but they don't see it as a coherent memorial in that way. And I think that's one of the things that's very New York, in a very commercial city, that we tend to see even when they're intricately choreographed, as Grand Army Plaza is, that we tend to lose that sense of it. Trafalgar Square fascinates me because it's an extraordinary urban space, and it is bounded by all of that important institutional life, National Gallery and St. Martin in the Fields and all that. But it seems to come alive as a shared space only in moments of extremis, when wars begin, when wars end, when we're trying to struggle to end nuclear armament, something like that. So it has that special quality. And I suppose now that I think about it, not unlike the mall in Washington has some of that. Not really a public square in that way, but a very effective gathering place.
Absolutely, and designed specifically to represent the identity of the nation.
Yeah, exactly. Right, exactly. A gentleman here, and then I'll come to this lady. Gentleman here.
Obviously, as you mentioned, a lot of these squares historically go through periods where maybe they become a bit derelict, maybe sometimes they're even dangerous to go to, which has happened obviously in New York and also in a lot of other cities. And then at times they will come back, they'll be revitalized again. Do you think there is a role for government or for cities to try to revitalize a square that may have slid into sort of an undesirable place to be, or does that in fact fly in the face of the whole idea of a democratic environment that's open to everybody?
Well, right off the cuff, I think of Jane Jacobs, and I think of what she's always said about parks. And to have a successful park, you have to have diversity of use, diversity of people, and different uses all day long. And I think it might be hard for the government to try to create that, but I also really believe, particularly as these cities are building up and getting more and more crowded, that these public spaces should be preserved. And if the government can help to do that, absolutely. And when you think, for instance, we just talked about those triangles in Times Square or Madison Square, which aren't my favorite places, but those were created by the government. Those were created by the Bush administration, and again, they become hugely popular.
I think that one of the essential functions of government is exactly to build public infrastructure of that kind, where you can't dictate what will happen politically in it, but that you enable people to have commonplace civilization in Olmsted's sense. I think that's a hugely important role for a government to play. And in its absence, one of the beautiful things is people improvise it. One of the ones that come to mind, if any of you lived downtown in the 1970s or 80s, you'll remember that there was you did, right? There was a little triangle between Canal Street and Tribeca, sort of marked the break.
I remember that totally.
Right, between Soho and Tribeca. And I've written about it because I used to meet Kirk Varnado there, and we would trade papers when we were writing together at midnight. And I was reading Eric Fischel's autobiography not long ago, and he and David Sally, the two wonderful young expressionist painters, had a fight in that space that wasn't resolved for 20 years. And people need a space in which to interact and to intersect. And it seems to me that, for me at least, defines one of the functions of certainly civic government in that way. Let me come to you in a second. Let me come to this lady here, or this lady here.
Yeah, well, I have two questions. First of all, who was the king that built Place de Grève?
Henri IV.
Now, secondly, I thought so. Now, the second thing I wanted to ask you, I've been going to Hong Kong a lot, and my grandchildren that are growing up there, and it is amazing. Every time we go to a different neighborhood, this, I don't know what you call it, a park or a square, but a part of it is always, they define what age, and the children just run to it, whether it's 3 to 5 or, they have different times. But they always have exercise things, and they have in Japan also, for older people. And it's amazing. We've never copied that anywhere in the United States.
What a good idea. The geriatric square. Right? We'll shortly need it. Right?
Yes, exactly.
It gets a mixture of ages.
Yeah, no, that's
And
right.
also, these squares popping up, and you know, the way Hong Kong is built like this, that they managed to build it in the middle of this.
I do think that's fascinating. I didn't know that, and I've never been lucky enough to visit Hong Kong. But one of the things that always strikes me is that if there's a kind of one of the pervasive social crises that we deal with is the isolation, segregation of the old, of the aged in our cities and in our society. And anything that tends to break that down, I think, is a hugely positive sign. Have you thought about that at all, Katie? The role of the old, the
Well,
senior?
Michael Kuhlman talks in his introduction on culture about a square in Italy where the older people went to meet, and then there was an earthquake, and it all fell apart. And these people had nowhere to go, and they were devastated. They created little places to do it, but it was nothing like a square.
Isn't it one of the great pleasures of being in Italy, right, for those of us who are Italophiles, is any town, any village, any hill town, any town, you see the piazza, right? And you're always, and it acts as an actual gathering place. And the thing you always notice is the most beautiful, thin, sexy 20-year-olds in the world are there on one side of it, and then these tank-shaped people, right, on the other side, and you're always wondering how the transmutation takes place, right? Pasta, I suppose, is the thing. Gentlemen here.
In response to the gentleman who asked
infrastructure and civic
and governmental responsibility, especially in the city, thanks to Ms. Rogers, our city was able to transform Central Park, and with other people like Ms. Rogers, individuals, transform Prospect Park through creating a nonprofit organization, in this sense, the Conservancy. And without that, we all, perhaps most of us, remember the 1970s, and Central Park, the park was a dust bowl. And it was a disaster and an embarrassment. At the same time that the government let us down in terms of our parks and perhaps squares too. Union Square is a good example. Dan Biederman, who is Ms. Rogers of Bryant Park, through a business improvement district, the government, in a sense, privatized the park and gave tax incentives to all of the businesses surrounding the park. And as perhaps you know, the businesses and the corporations around Bryant Park, through tax incentives, are cleaning it up and are gardening and have been doing this, and were inspired by Luxembourg Park in Paris. So the government is what it is, but it's really individuals that the government has been wise enough to allow to transform their job in an even better way.
Katie,
I think we probably have time, Sarah, right?
let me just say one thing, if I may, to that, because I think it's absolutely true. And I'm old enough to remember Central Park in the 70s, and in fact, we were watching the charming movie The Out-of-Towners, Neil Simon comedy with Jack Lemmon and Sandy Dennis not long ago, which I think was made in like 71 or 72. And my kids could not believe, they shot it on location, that Central Park looked that way in that time. The only thing I'd add to that, because it's something that all of us who are lucky enough to live near the park and to benefit from those extraordinary public-private partnerships, which have been so transformative, have to think about is spreading that particular kind of social energy and those kinds of partnerships elsewhere in the city and elsewhere out. The one thing we can't let happen, it seems to me, is for those to become prerogatives of the privileged rather than common goods for the public. I think
one more point to that, what you were saying. Well, you were talking about Luxembourg Gardens, and that is meant, some people say, to be the most well-designed park in the world, and it's really my favorite place, or one of my two favorite places in the world. But as you said it, I thought about the boat basin, and that whole area, and its own way, that's a square within the park. I'd never thought about that until just now.
It's certainly a square for the 7-year-olds of Paris who treated that way. I think we have time for one more question. This is a wonderful conversation. I hate to bring it to
Can I
close.
have a question at the end?
Of course. You can have a statement at the end. One more person. Lady here.
Well, this is prompted by Catie's observation that a lot of autocratic regimes regret the existence of their Tahrir Square, the Tiananmen Square, at certain times when there's protests. But I'm wondering about new cities. And is there a consensus as to what people need in the way of public space and squares? Is there any, a city in China versus a city in Brazil, I assume would be quite different in how they approach this?
That's a very good question. What is kind of the wisdom in urban planning and in urban anthropology now about making squares?
It's a question I've thought of, and I have not I haven't researched it very well. My sense is that it's all over the lot, but I have read certain articles that say you need this public space. So I think there will be a leaning towards that, and I think this is, in a way, one of those tipping point moments for public space, the appreciation of parks, for what the value of green space, what it does for people in all sorts of ways, and particularly in health. And I think also the same thing goes for squares.
I think one of the things that the only complication that I'm aware of is this is the 100th anniversary of Jane Jacobs' birth. We're celebrating this year. Lots of people are talking about it. And one of the things that comes to mind is that making green spaces, one of the points Jane Jacobs always made was that you sort of had to, as you were saying a moment ago, Katie, kind of find your spaces in a way that you couldn't artificially drop them down in the middle. And that was one of the failures of a lot of public housing developments in the recent past.
Yeah, she always said that just putting down a beautiful green space or a beautiful park will not make an area great.
Mm-hmm.
They run hand in hand and they go together. I would like to end, if I could, with one question, because you can tell Adam knows about so many things, and he knows a lot about history, and he knows about New York history. And he told me briefly about the genesis of the Society Library. So could you tell about that?
Well, this was one of those cool things that I think shows why my wife is crazy to ever think of leaving New York, even though they've got green and birds and who knows what else, all out there in Connecticut, trees and all kinds of stuff. And that is that we went to see the great musical theater piece, Hamilton. We hauled in tickets that are kind of well, My Fair Lady doesn't begin to touch it. They're the kind of the golden ticket, like in Willy Wonka, of our current entertainment economy. Anyway, we went to see it. It was fantastic, as all of you will know, who have seen it, one of the great things of our time. And it got me fascinated with the life of Alexander Hamilton. So I went off and bought I experienced it backwards. Lin-Manuel was inspired by Ron Chernoff's biography of Alexander Hamilton. I saw the show and then went out and bought the book, read it on one of these endless plane rides out to Portland, actually. And one of the things that's astonishing is that this institution, New York Society Library, plays a major role in the first half of that book, because it's the library and the civic space, if you like, that Hamilton and the other revolutionaries, the radicals, use and make, create, invent, and exploit. Exactly because it's the one place that you can find books and learning that are neither under the control of the king nor of the church. So that was its very special role, because he's going to school at what's called King's College at that point, and those places are not places that welcome patriots in that way, and where they feel entirely at home. So that this place, then downtown, now uptown, played exactly that central Olmstedian role of being a repository of the commonplace civilization of the heroic generation of patriots. And I learned only moments ago, so that not only did Hamilton take out books here, but so did Aaron Burr, sir, and that, maybe this is a good place to conclude. Apparently, General President George Washington not only took out books here, he failed to return them. And George Washington still is books that are overdue to this library, and they want the books back. Thank you so much, Katie. Thank you.